This week, young Republicans were accused of loving Hitler. Should the right just shrug it off? Matt Walsh wants unity, but does that include with real extremists? And the left claims that the Supreme Court's about to destroy voting rights. Is any of it true? Let's get into it. Alright, we're back with another video. I got busy, took about a 2-week break, went to Indiana for a wedding, and then started a new job. But hopefully I can get into a rhythm with these posts. I'm sticking with my 3 big things format for now. Watch the full thing or use timestamps to jump around to what interests you the most. Today we're tackling 3 major topics that are driving discourse in right-wing circles online. The leaked Young Republicans chat, the call for unity by Matt Walsh, and then we'll break down what's really in Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act and expose some of the lies being told about it by the mainstream media. With that, let's get started. So, as you've probably seen by now, Politico published leaked messages from a Telegram chat that included leaders of young Republican groups across the country. We had about 7 months of messages, and it included members from New York, Kansas, Arizona, and Vermont. People between the ages of 18 and 40. Now, we'll look at a few of the messages later, but what I really want to talk about is the response that we're seeing. Because Republicans are dividing into 2 clear camps over how to handle this story. Some, like Matt Walsh at the Daily Wire and J.D. Vance, say that we should just ignore it. They argue that it's a distraction, a deliberate attempt to pull focus away from Jay Jones in North Carolina. Now, if you don't know, Jay Jones is running for Attorney General and was caught saying in a private chat that he wants Republican children to die so that their parents feel pain. Obviously, Republicans, myself included, have condemned that, and we have been calling for Jones to drop out of the race. But he hasn't, and unbelievably, his fundraising has actually increased since the chats were released. So I do understand why people like Walsh think that the Young Republican story was released to drown out Jones's scandal. And honestly, they're absolutely right. If Jay Jones's chat had not made news, this Republican chat likely would not have either. But pretending the leak does not matter is a mistake. It makes us look like we're doing exactly what Democrats do, ignoring a problem on our own side. Now, there's an important distinction here. Jay Jones is a candidate for office, someone who could soon oversee prosecutions and legal policy in a relatively purple state. That's serious. By contrast, these young Republicans hold no office and were mostly joking around. Take the line that Politico led with, "I love Hitler." On its face, that's shocking, and yeah, it deserves criticism. But if you read the full exchange, one person said that the delegates will vote for the most right-wing person, and another replied, "Great, I love Hitler." It's clearly a sarcastic exaggeration, a humorous way to say that he deserves the votes because he's as far right as possible. Politico built a headline out of that anyway. Now, the Jay Jones situation also included a joke. If I'm being fair, one of Jones's own lines went like this. If Hitler, Pol Pot, and a Republican were in a room with him, and he had 2 bullets, the Republican would get both bullets. And that's an old dark joke I've heard before. I've usually heard it with Hitler and Stalin, but he used Pol Pot, whatever. But the key difference is that Jones doubled down later. When this person called him out about wanting a Republican officeholder's kids to die, Jones confirmed that he meant it. Only when people feel pain personally do they move on policy. That's not satire, that's not a joke. That's him expressing a real wish for children to die. That's clearly worse than a group of young party members riffing among themselves. But here's where I part ways with Matt Walsh and J.D. Vance. Although Jay Jones is worse, pretending the whole thing does not exist is not good politics either. Because to an independent voter, a suburban mom, a moderate conservative, or a 50-something who doesn't live on Twitter, those jokes about Hitler and racial slurs come off as disgusting, even if the people saying them thought they were just being funny. We can acknowledge that nuance. Most of these guys were joking, yeah, but to a normal person that language is just gross. And if we want to be taken seriously as a party, not just with our base, but with swing voters, we've got to show that we recognize that. That's why Virginia gubernatorial candidate Winsome Earl Sears' response was absolutely perfect. When she was asked about the chat, she said, "Yeah, that's shameful." And then she pivoted right back to the Jay Jones issue. Quick, clean, adult. That's what the national response should have looked like from Republicans. Instead, when leaders act like there's nothing to see, it sends the wrong message, that we're okay with what was said. Now, am I saying that we should kick everyone in that group out of the party? Of course not, that would be insane. But when something obviously crosses a line, the response is simple. That was stupid, don't do that. That's all it would take to look responsible and win respect from independents. Because elections aren't just about firing up the base. They're about winning over those 50-50 voters. And we may even get some Democrat voters with how far left they've gone. Perception matters. People vote for what feels normal and decent, not what feels defensive or chaotic. Now, and here's the part that nobody's actually talking about. Why are so many young Republicans joking this way to begin with? I see it in my own circles. My friends, some of their younger brothers, guys my age and younger, find this stuff funny generally. And here's the thing. They're not actually neo-Nazis, and whether they know it or not, they're just reacting to how overwhelmingly moralized everything became online while they were growing up. For years, the left made it normal to cancel anyone who said a bad word 10 years ago. Every off-color joke, every edgy comment, instant outrage. They dug up tweets, ruined careers, and created a culture where people tiptoed through eggshells. So naturally, young people rebelled. When the culture says that you can't say that, rebellious teens and 20-somethings immediately go, watch me. That's human nature. The same way teenagers react when their parents ban something. They just want to do it more. Rebellion is fun, especially when it gets a reaction. And then came Trump. Suddenly, being anti-left became normal. And all those young guys who used edgy jokes to push buttons online felt like they didn't have to hide anymore. They didn't suddenly become actual extremists, like Politico wants you to believe. They just kept acting like being provocative was how you win attention. And in right-wing circles, especially among young people, it still can win attention. It's clear that the participants treated those messages like edgy, ironic humor. But when that goes public, that's where the problem starts. Because outsiders cannot tell when the irony stops. When the chat becomes public, the line between a joke and real hate gets blurrier the more you repeat it. And to others, repeated use of those jokes in that language makes it look like the Republican Party actually does love Hitler. When Matt Walsh and J.D. Vance refuse to say that we don't love Hitler, it makes us look bad to the average person. And that doesn't mean that we should panic or purge every young conservative who tries to be funny. It just means that we should lead by example. Show where the line is. Acknowledge the joke, but remind people why it's wrong. If we want to win, we can't sound like pearl clutchers on one end or apologists on the other. Just be normal. Call out the bad stuff, move on, and project basic decency. That's what most voters want. Normalcy, goodness, steadiness. Biden won in 2020, partly because people saw him as the normal guy. But the left has wandered so far now that Trump and Republicans actually look like the more rational, stable leaders. If Republicans can hold that ground, if we just look like the reasonable party, we'll win over the middle. And that starts with something simple. Just saying, yeah, that comment was gross. Because pretending that bad behavior does not exist does not make it go away. It just makes normal voters think that we don't care. And that's how you lose the middle. And look, I'll admit, sometimes now it is somewhat hard to tell between what's a joke and what's real, even for me, because there's a real growing faction of the right who actually are Hitler apologists. I don't see any evidence that those in this chat are on that side, as the messages were clearly jokes. But that does lead us into our second big thing, the debate over right-wing unity. Matt Walsh started a firestorm online this week by calling for unity among the different factions of the right. And I know that sounds insane. Why would a call for unity lead to outrage? Especially when his first call for unity, right after Charlie Kirk's assassination, was met mostly with agreement. Well, here's why. The Groypers, those Jew-hating, racist Groypers, believe that Charlie's death left a vacuum on the right. Kirk's main audience was young conservatives, and the Groypers are trying to fill that void and steal Charlie's audience. The most well-known and infamous of them, the leader of the Groypers, is Nick Fuentes, the guy who's publicly said that he hates Jews and will not hang out with any black person. He and his ilk have decided to make a bigger push into the mainstream right. Even I've started seeing his clips, and I've never followed him, nor will I. Alongside him are Holocaust deniers like Jake Shields, conspiracy peddlers like Candace Owens, and outright Hitler sympathizers like Ian Carroll. They see young Republicans making edgy jokes, and they want to convince those young Republicans that those jokes aren't just jokes, but actual real life. These people, the so-called rights, are making huge waves online, growing their audiences tenfold in platforms like X and YouTube since Charlie's assassination. So in the time since Matt first called for unity, those people have become a major part of right-wing discourse. And when Matt called for unity a second time, there was already a battle brewing between the mainstream right and those people. And so the question Matt's call for unity raised is this: should the mainstream right really unify with guys like Jake Shields? Is Nick Fuentes supposed to be welcomed into the mainstream Republican circles? Should Candace Owens, whose entire persona is accusing Trump and his team of covering up major stories on behalf of the Jews, be a real voice in the Republican Party? For me and many others, the answer is no, absolutely not. When people have asked Matt if his unity includes these people, he's refused to say no. And some have asked him to call out specific names, and fair enough, he hasn't. I get that. He knows some of these figures personally and doesn't want to blast friends or past colleagues. Fine, whatever. But that's not the heart of the problem. The issue isn't that Matt won't name names, it's that he refuses to say that Hitler-loving, Jew-hating extremists are not part of the right. It's one thing to debate Israel aid. Fine, let's have that debate. But debating whether Hitler was right, that's the line you can't cross if you want to represent the Republican Party. And that's what Matt avoids saying, and why people are upset. Matt's made it clear that his ultimate goal is defeating the left, who want him and his family dead. And look, I get that, and he says he'll unite with anyone who shares that mission. I understand the instinct to say that. But should that include Hitler apologists? He argues that left-wing radicals are far worse than those on the far right, because the left, through abortion, has killed 60 million babies. But the people he refuses to exclude are the same ones who would gladly kill two of his colleagues at the Daily Wire, Ben Shapiro and Andrew Klavan. Ben, as we all know, is a devout Jew. Andrew is a Jewish convert to Christianity. But to those people, that's still not good enough. They still believe that Andrew is still Jewish and worthy of hate. To me, that's more than enough reason to draw a line in the Republican Party. On the Daily Wire's new show, Friendly Fire, the team debated this exact thing. And really, credit to them for not shying away from this discussion. But on that, Matt reiterated that he'll unite with anyone on the right. And when asked, I think by Michael Knowles, but maybe it was Ben, what defines the right, Matt said, and later repeated online, that he'll unify with anyone who wants to uphold Western civilization. And I actually agree with that in principle, absolutely. But he and I apparently disagree on who's really upholding Western civilization. As I said before, Western civilization stands on three great pillars: Rome, Athens, and Jerusalem. From Rome we get our legal system, from Athens our reasoning, from Jerusalem our morality. Anyone who tears down any one of those three pillars threatens the entire structure. And the Hitler apologists are doing exactly that, undermining the Jerusalem pillar. And it's not simply because they oppose aid to Israel or even that they hate Jews. It's because they pervert the Bible. They twist the foundation of our moral order for their own political gain. They dream of turning Western civilization into a white ethno-state where their enemies are killed and Jews banned. And they use the Bible to make their arguments. And that's the Hitler apologist faction. You could argue that Candace or even some Groypers still support Western values. I'd probably disagree, but that's a different debate. But the core point is that Matt and I disagree on who truly defends Western civilization. We just draw that line differently. And that's fine. I'm not writing him off for it. Matt's done incredible work, and I believe will continue to do great work for the conservative movement. I largely agree with him on domestic social issues, but other issues like foreign policy, I disagree with him. And this is a time that I think he's wrong. Now, Matt says that his top priority is winning, and that he has different principles than those urging him to denounce others by name. And I get that. But I have principles too. When it comes to politics, sure, I'll tell you what I believe. But my core principle is winning. I want to unite with the right people, those who actually help us win. If someone hurts our cause, I don't care how Republican they claim to be, they're not on our team. Right now, the Groypers want to take over the Republican Party. They've made that clear since Charlie's death. And the problem is, they're radicals, deeply radical. I'm fine if they want to vote red. I'll take the votes, sure. If Groyper votes red, fine. If red becomes Groyper, we lose. We lose conservatives, we lose independents, we lose minorities who have started drifting our way. We lose new voters who fled the left because they went insane. Bottom line, we lose. If we want to win as a movement, we can't let the extremists take the wheel. We can't unite with the openly racist, the openly anti-Semitic. Debating foreign aid, fine, good, healthy. But saying Hitler was good and Churchill was the villain, then you're out. We all know the phrase, a country with no borders is not a country. The same goes for political parties. The left's learning that the hard way. And if Matt gets his way and the Groypers groyp their way into Republican leadership, then we'll learn it too. The truth is we're on track to win long term if we just stay our course. But if we let these bad faith actors erode the movement's biblical and moral foundation for their own gain, we lose everything. My principle is winning. Let's keep it that way. Let's win. And that brings us to our third big thing, the Voting Rights Act. One of the biggest stories this week was the Supreme Court hearing the case Louisiana versus Calais, which centers on Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. If you look online, you'd think democracy just got canceled. MSNBC says Justice Kavanaugh could push the Supreme Court to further limit voting rights. The Guardian warns the court appears ready to nullify the Voting Rights Act. In Democracy Docket, SCOTUS ready to scrap fair elections, greenlight racial discrimination, and hand the House to the GOP. Now, if Democracy Docket were telling the truth, that would be bad. Outside of Nick Fuentes and his ilk, you won't find anybody who wants congressional districts drawn by racial makeup. Wait, hold on. Actually, that's exactly what Section 2 does, and it's exactly what the left is fighting to protect. So let's break this down. I'll put the statute up on the screen, but I'll break it down in plain English because we know that Congress can't ever use plain English. That would make their law degrees useless. Section 2A says that states can't have any voting rule or process that results in denying someone the right to vote based on race, color, or language. The key phrase is results in, which means intent does not matter. Section 2B says the state violates the law if, based on totality of the circumstances, the political process isn't equally open. It also says courts can look at whether minority candidates are getting elected as evidence, but it does not guarantee proportional representation. A state that's 30% black isn't required to have 30% of its officials be black. It sounds fair enough, right? But here's what happened. Louisiana, which is 1/3 black, had one majority black congressional district. A lower court said that wasn't enough, citing Section 2, and forced the state to redraw its map. And now 2 of their 6 districts are majority black. And maybe that was the correct ruling based on the language of Section 2, but that's not the issue right now. What's at issue is the constitutionality of Section 2. The court used a law meant to stop racial discrimination to force a state to redraw lines based on racial demographics. They literally made Louisiana discriminate to prevent discrimination. And there is actually legal precedent that allows that. The Supreme Court itself has said that racism can be used in limited cases to fix past racism. In Fullilove v. Klutznick in 1980, they upheld a rule requiring 10% of federal public works funds to go to minority-owned firms, calling it substantially related to remedying the present effects of past discrimination. In other words, discrimination was okay as long as it fixed older discrimination. But that raises a question. How long do we get to justify new discrimination by blaming the old kind? Before we look at that, let's look at what Section 2's defenders are arguing. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson defended Section 2 by comparing it to the ADA. Basically, her argument is that nobody intended to discriminate against people in wheelchairs, but buildings without ramps still exclude them. And Congress was able to step in to fix that accidental discrimination. Fair enough, but in using that logic, she then argues that being black is a disability in and of itself. Let's listen.
Congress passed the Americans with Disabilities Act against the backdrop of a world that was generally not accessible to people with disabilities. And so it was discriminatory in effect because these folks were not able to access these buildings. And it didn't matter whether the person who built the building or the person who owned the building intended for them to be exclusionary. That's irrelevant. Congress said the facilities have to be made equally open to people with disabilities if readily possible. I guess I don't understand why that's not what's happening here. The idea in Section 2 is that we are responding to current day manifestations of past and present decisions that disadvantage minorities and make it so that they don't have equal access to the voting system, right? They're disabled.
So there it is. Being black and trying to vote presents the same sort of challenges as being in a wheelchair and trying to get into a building. And that's just dumb. No law prevents black people from voting or running for office today. Her analogy falls apart on its face. So we go back to our question. How long can remedying past discrimination justify present discrimination? Because by forcing Louisiana to draw 2 majority black districts, the courts in 2025 are doing what civil rights activists fought against in 1965, sorting people by race. That's not progress, it's segregation with paperwork. Even the Supreme Court has already said that this kind of thing cannot last forever. In Grutter v. Bollinger in 2003, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor upheld affirmative action in college admissions. But she said that it should end once diversity could be achieved without looking at race. She wrote, "The court expects that 25 years from now, the use of racial preferences will no longer be necessary." And sure enough, in 2023, just 20 years later, the court struck it down. Race-conscious admissions were declared unconstitutional. The logic was simple. The goal of remedying past discrimination had been met. Now, the court has the chance to apply that same logic to Section 2. And honestly, it's an even stronger case. Why? Because when affirmative action ended, black college enrollment was proportional to population, about 12.5%, roughly matching the U.S. demographics. Since then, the black enrollment at the top universities has declined, so one could make the argument that we should still be using affirmative action. But with voting, the argument's even clearer. The goals of the Voting Rights Act have been met, and there is no chance to backslide into a racist voting system. Look around. Half of the 60 black members of Congress today come from districts with white majorities or pluralities. Half. Byron Donalds represents Florida's 19th district, 74% white. Burgess Owens got elected in Utah. On the Democrat side, there's Ayanna Pressley in Massachusetts. In 2014, only 8 of 43 black lawmakers came from white majority districts. Today, it's 30 out of 60. That's a milestone. And if that's not enough proof, Barack Obama was elected twice by a majority white electorate. That wasn't a single gerrymandered district. That was the entire country. We're not living in 1965. Nobody is denying black Americans the right to vote. What we're debating now is whether race still needs to be used as a crutch when there's no limp left to fix. So when defenders of Section 2 say, some black lawmakers might lose their seats, maybe that's true. But if your seat only exists because the map was racially engineered, then it's not representation, it's a quota. And racial quotas are, or at least should be, unconstitutional. Section 2B itself says that it doesn't create a right to proportional representation. But forcing Louisiana, a one-third black state, to draw 2 out of 6 black majority districts, that's literally 33%, one-third. That's proportionality by force. So what happens when Section 2 goes down? We get back to what the Constitution actually demands. Equal representation by population, not by pigment. Each district must have roughly the same number of people. One person, one vote. It's not one race, one district. And if Democrats are panicking that they'll lose seats when they can't racially gerrymander, maybe that's the problem right there. Because the data already proves that black candidates can win in white districts. They already are winning in white districts, 30 of them right now. The era of using discrimination to remedy discrimination is over. The Supreme Court ended it for colleges in 2023, and if they stay consistent, and let's be honest, they probably will, they'll end it for voting in 2026. Because at some point, you have to stop discriminating in the name of stopping discrimination. As I said, it's one person, one vote, not one race, one district. If you made it this far, seriously, thank you. Even if you just jumped to what interested you, thanks for being here. Hit like, drop a comment, tell me where you agree or if you think I missed the mark. The best part of this channel is the conversation I hope to create down in the comments. I'll see you next week with more of the biggest stories in politics, maybe a little culture, maybe some faith. I try to get it all on this channel. And to hit cultural real quick, I just went and saw Truth and Treason, the new Angel Studios movie about Helmuth Hubener, the youngest German Nazi resistor. I won't tell you too much about it, but go see it. Tremendous movie. Anyways, until next week.